I'm Luca Giliberti, contributing writer at Gold Derby, and I am joined today by Mark Friedberg, the production designer on the Underground Railroad, Barry Jenkins' 10-episode limited series that is based on Colson Whitehead's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel of the same name. Mark, before the Underground Railroad, you had already worked with Barry Jenkins on his 2018 feature If Beale Street Could Talk. How did that experience shape and or facilitate your collaboration on the Underground Railroad?
It shaped it because we knew each other and he hired me to do Underground Railroad. There was, right from the start, he was already working on Underground Railroad. It was present in the air. He had writers working on it, etc. And I had, of course, read the book. We had a very good, I hope, experience on If Beale Street Could Talk, a movie of a shared experience that we had, a quintessential African-American story that was the first Baldwin novel that I know of made into a film, which is pretty remarkable that that it took this long for it to be the first, but also remarkable that after winning an Oscar that he chose to make a low-budget art film when he could have done anything, low-budget meaningful art film, something that had meaning for him when he could have done anything he wanted, which registered for me clearly. But also very much a story about this city that I grew up in, set roughly in the time of my youth. So something that I could speak to personally. And so I think based in, and it was, those guys had won an Oscar on $1 million movie and they came to New York with $8 million feeling rich. And it doesn't quite work that way, sadly. It's almost less money. And so it was a bit of a, there was some dancing involved. And Barry is an elegant dancer. He's just not somebody who's focused on what he can't do, what the limitations presented are. And I really appreciated that. But basically, based on all of that, I don't know. I don't know if there was an official day that he said, "Would you like to do this?" It somehow just I was always kind of doing it. I don't know how it happened, but maybe because it was in the air, or because he was working on it, or maybe he did say, "Hey, Mark, do you want to do this?" But all I know is there was a point at which I was doing it and I was excited. It's an epic, giant American story, a truth-telling American story, and something that I was really excited, if that's a word you could use for this, this sort of horribleness of what we had to depict. But I was excited to work with him and to try to tell this story in the way that he wanted to tell it, with his particular point of view, which is something that I really had a lot of respect for.
So you've obviously worked on television before. In fact, you won an Emmy in 2011 for your work on another limited series, HBO's Mildred Pierce. But how was it working on something like The Underground Railroad, in which every episode is essentially different from all the others, specifically in regard to the settings? Do you relish getting to create all these different worlds in the same project, and I'm assuming with the same people?
That's a lot of questions, but I will unpack them, I think, one by one. Most of my life, most of my professional life, 30 plus years of making scenery or making settings or designing worlds, has been in cinema. I've done 2 limited series now, both with feature directors, and both with in situations where the person who wrote the piece also directed every episode. So it felt, and both with people I had worked with before. For us, the language of the storytelling specifically was very similar. The craft was very similar. We didn't really perceive that we were making television versus cinema. We were telling a story. I think I had a prejudice against television. I know I did for years, but for years that was warranted because a lot of television was really there to create space between the commercials, and the production value of the commercials was remarkably better than that of the episodic network television. But with the advent of streaming and with the way we live now and giant LCD, LED, OLED screens in our living rooms and projection theaters in our basements, the cinema is more integrated into our life at home, and maybe less of becoming more and more less of an event, something to do at night. I grew up going to the movies because that's where you could get content with my family, and television was there was, you know, there was 12 channels that turned off at 11. Now there's 7,000 channels. I can watch any movie ever made anytime I want on a giant television in 4K, and at the theater it's only 2K. So uh, I've come around to what television, plus those of us in cinema have all been watching each other's movies on screeners for the last 15 years. You know, most of us have seen each other's work not in the theater. So to be a cinema snob kind of has lost its luster. Having said that, 90-minute stories have limitations, what they can include. They are, in a sense, novellas or short stories, expanded short stories, whereas a limited series can be a novel, can be chapter oriented. So to that end, it's pretty exciting to be able to travel themes through 10 episodes in 5 states and over time and various characters. There's more you can do, or there's more we did do. There's deeper themes, and they are rendered with more detail, and there's the ability to be tangential and to leave the central themes for moments to create supporting alternative themes. So for all those reasons, it's turned into a very exciting format to tell stories in cinematically. In the case of the Underground Railroad, it really felt like we made 10 features or 8 features. You know, Tennessee and Indiana were kind of 2 parts of the same stories, but they were approached that way. They were approached that way narratively. They were approached that way stylistically. We actually were eager to distinguish each chapter, to make each place seem like a different stop along the way of the American experience, African American experience. And so yeah, it was very exciting, and it's a cool format. I enjoy it. I appreciate it.
And while the Underground Railroad is very much telling a fictional story, it is ultimately and unimpeachably rooted in history and takes place in 1800s United States. Could you talk me through the research you did in order to recreate parts of this very specific period in US history?
It is about a very specific period in history, but I take issue with the fact that it's very much about 1850. I think the novel is set in 1850, and it's about 1950 and 2050 and 1750 and really 1619. It's the point, or the way that Colson Whitehead has structured the story is for us to believe for a moment that we're in a particular time, but all of a sudden there's trains that run underground, and there's skyscrapers, and there's elevators. Those things didn't exist in 1850, but you don't really question it in the narrative as you're reading it until you maybe get past it and then stop for a minute and say, wait a minute. It's not like he's advertising that, because I think what he's really pushing, or what is one of the strengths of the structure of the novel that Barry leaned into, is the fact that it's very much about the world we live in now, and that if we think that we've gotten past these things, if we think we're living in a post-racial society, if we think that there is not a systemic racism built into the way that we live, that is genetic, that is encrusted into the inception of this great nation and all the things it stands for, then we're missing the point. And also more than just that, things are terrible for African American people, or have been and continue to be in lots of different ways, and that so many times our culture has, in the name of maybe building them up, torn them even farther down. In the face of all that, those same people are the people who built this country. They built it physically for no money, but they also built it politically. The great moments of our fights for freedom and rights in this country have not been often led by the political establishment. They've been led by the political fringe, and they've often been led by African Americans in Reconstruction, in the Civil Rights Movement, in recent months. That's a theme in our story, and I believe it to be at the central core of the novel and Barry's point of view, which is not so much that things were terrible. We understand that, or maybe we need to keep understanding it. But there's something we know about that part, or that's not the point. The point is, yes, they were terrible, but look how this group of Americans reacted. And I think that, that's part of the metaphor of the train. That's part of the metaphor of a lot of the other parts of the story. But that it's set in 1850, sorry, I haven't even answered your question, is it's certainly particular, but it's also, I think, not the whole point. If you would like me to answer that question, my research is I'm an American history person. It was what I studied in college. It's what interested me up until recent years, although now it's really a hard thing to look at. Where are you? Where am I talking to you from?
Germany.
Right. So unlike your culture, who's also maybe had a few stumbles along the way, we kind of refuse to acknowledge it and have never really had a reconciliation. South Africa, the first thing Mandela did was not put all the apartheid people in jail. It was to establish a reconciliation commission, to be able to have it out. Let's just say what it was. It sucked, and let's try and get past it. Vengeance doesn't really have a place in all this. Anger isn't really going to help, but talking it out, figuring out a way to avoid these kinds of things in the future and trying to create a better version of now does. We can't seem to do that here for some reason. I mean, in fact, look at this place. It's really coming apart in so many ways. In fact, you're asking me about 1850. Well, 1850 is what's happening in America right now. We are in an 1850 mode. We are polarized in a way that we haven't been since then. And when we get like this, unfortunately, in this country, it's historically been very difficult for us to unify without catharsis, a world war or a civil war. And God knows what's going to happen in the future for us. But also 1850 was the year of the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act in America was in reaction to the expansion of the Western states and the fact that that meant that the imbalance or the balance of slave states to non-slave states was going to slant towards non-slave states, and the slave states couldn't handle it, and went back on a lot of agreements. There was something called the Missouri Compromise, which was about what states who would determine their own relationship to slavery or not. And ultimately, the Fugitive Slave Act, a federal law, made it illegal for a slave to run away anywhere in the country, and it gave permission to law enforcement to redact them, to take them back anywhere in the country, and it made it illegal not to assist those people. So if you harbored a runaway slave, that made you, even if you were in a free state, that made you federally complicit, and it was a big deal, and it was probably the thing that lit the first, that was the first big match on the fuse that John Brown found that finally blew up into the Civil War. Does that answer your question?
That's very insightful. And just to get into some of the specific designs of the show, I would like to start with the Rental Plantation, which really is a centerpiece of the show. You have talked about how important it was to you to highlight that this was in fact also a living area and a communal space for these enslaved people. So could you elaborate on that and talk me through the specifics of creating their space or creating this space?
Sure. The first thing I noticed in the script was that the slave quarters were in the shadow of the big house. Oftentimes, that's the way that slave quarters are depicted in cinema. We don't have a lot of photographs of the slave quarters. People weren't going around taking a lot of pictures of the way they house their enslaved humans. And let's just say those things weren't built to last. There are a few, so we know a little bit about it. But we also know that if you do live in a plantation, big house, probably the cotton field is not in your backyard. You've got hundreds of thousands of acres. You have to go to where the cotton is. Most likely, the people who worked in the house lived near the house, and the people who worked in the fields lived near the fields. Why would you waste an hour a day of people commuting from where you live to the cotton fields? And also, the slave master didn't want these populations right in their backyards. So for all of those reasons, we thought it illogical to have the slave quarters behind the big house. But more importantly, we wanted this story not to be about the masters of slavery. That's not the point of this story. Slave stories are so often about the oppressor, and because they're told by white people. This was a story about a community of people, a race of people, a culture of people, and as such, we wanted not to focus on only their plight, but also on their majesty, on what they were able to achieve in all of this. And what was very clear to me is that the people who lived in these horrible circumstances, whose families were regularly broken up, who were raped, who were murdered, who were worked to death, also had families, also maintained some semblance of culture that they were ripped apart, away from, and in many cases culturally engineered away from. And we wanted to lean into that fact. The story starts in the slave quarters, but it's a reverie. It's the people are singing, people are dancing. You hear African beats. You smell the food that's being cooked. It's almost okay for a split second, until of course the Randall brothers walk in and the record scratches, and it's all the air goes out of the moment, and in fact it goes from reverie to horror very quickly. Brutal, sadistic horror. So I think that was part of it. I didn't want it to be Auschwitz. It's a different situation. It was a work camp for sure. People were murdered for sure. There are definitely analogies between concentration camps and plantations, but at the same time, this was a life that was allowed to in some cases allowed to develop, and we really wanted to show where Cora got her strength from, as well, that it wasn't just some freak of nature, but that there was strength from her friendships, strength from her family, familial connections, and in fact when they were broken, it both broke, it helped break her down, but also it gave her the fire she needed to persevere through all this. We wanted somehow to find beauty and horror at the same time. And I think that was our design goal, which is a tricky thing to find.
That's very interesting. And another centerpiece, of course, is the railroad itself, which you've already mentioned. I know Barry was very adamant on using as little CGI as possible. So could you describe how you ultimately designed and constructed the train and the entire underground scenery, also bearing in mind what it really stood for and what its symbolic meaning was?
Symbolically, the railroad, or metaphorically, the railroad depicts the underpinnings of our society that were constructed by those we enslaved, those we treated the worst. The fact of their achievement in the face of this ridiculous oppression, and the fact that there has been always, from its inception, a burning desire for freedom. There is some misconception, huge misconception, in the way slavery is portrayed in this country, how it's portrayed out of this country, that in some ways the slaves were kind of okay with it. Sort of the similar thing like that you hear about how the Jews sort of went off without a fight to the concentration camps. Clearly, there was a lot of engineering to prevent any kind of resistance and rebellion, but it continued to happen. And throughout slavery, there have been, in America, there have been rebellions, there have been escapes, and there has been a network of human beings who risk their lives to free their fellow humans, black and white. But often the Underground Railroad is often also depicted as white people saving black people. That's just not how it was. Harriet Tubman was freed herself, or escaped herself, and risked her life 10 different times, going back to collect friends and relatives and other slaves and help them to freedom, risked herself. Technically, Barry said to me, yeah, real trains, real actors, real tunnel. I said, okay, that was really how we started. That was his, I don't know how you're going to do it, Mark, but that's important. That's imperative. I can't have a CG train pull in. It's got to be real. So I don't know, I've done some train work in my life. Made a whole movie on a train, Darjeeling Limited. So I understand how complicated they are as machines, and how limited we are as not commercial entities, not shipping entities, to use them. Trains, there's one track, it goes this way, it goes that way, or there's 5 tracks, but there's not like there are on roads. You can just go there and do it, and not too many people have track that's not part of a giant system. That means it's hard to get on it and get off it. I understood that we weren't going to shoot on commercial track, so I had to find a place that I could control some track. We found it in Georgia, in Savannah, Georgia, at a small train museum. There is a culture in this country of preservation of trains. People are obsessed with them, and this is an amazing nonprofit museum, almost an art museum in a way, the way they treat their trains. And I partnered with them to build a tunnel over their track and modify their trains that they had so that we could tell our story. And for budgetary reasons and logistic reasons, we started out thinking, oh, we're going to build miles of track, and no, you're not building miles of anything. You don't need to either. But what we ended up doing was building one long tunnel and adjoining the stations and changing out the stations and adjusting the area in the tunnel near the station so that each one felt different and looked different and was different. And it was powerful that we were able to be in this space. It really felt, when you went in there, it felt like proprietary space. It felt like you entered the story in a way. There was this real train and you were in this tunnel. The other thing about the tunnel that was very important is the way it was carved, the way it was made to look. It was made to look that it was carved by hand tools through the earth, that this was an act of intense, passionate labor, and that there was emotion in the surfaces themselves. So that answers your question.
Yes, perfect. Well, I fear we've run out of time, Mark, but thank you so much for shedding light on your process, and thank you so much for joining us today. To our viewers, make sure to go to goldderby.com to make your predictions, and before you go, click subscribe to watch all of our great content with top contenders. Thank you so much.
Be well.